Good afternoon. We are, I think, I'm getting somebody nodding at me. I think that means we begin. Thank you very much for coming to this session. We will enjoy comments and remarks from some leading people working in this field, so very grateful for you all agreeing to be here. You, the audience, and online, if possible, can also look forward to engaging on this topic. So we'll do the normal format, and then we'll have some interpretive dance. No, we'll do panel remarks from each individual person, and then I'll try and stir them up a bit, and then open it up to you. We have a lot of territory to cover. I think the space of data protection and data privacy, cybersecurity, and so on is a growing influence in society and politics all over the world, and even some argue it's more important in the sensitive humanitarian settings in which you work than it might be in a more stable context. So I think some people have been ringing alarm bells on this issue for some time, and I think they're starting to be heard partly because of the news. Even in just today's news, 2 new developments might be of interest. That Chinese manufacturers were inserting a special chip into computers sold to Amazon and Apple and used by intelligence agencies so that they could listen in. Interesting. And the Dutch have arrested Russian spies parking outside the chemical OCPW, the chemical weapons inspectors, trying to hack their Wi-Fi. So you'll be glad to know all of you could also suffer these attacks. If those people could, then you can too. And next time you come to a conference, don't sign on Karl or Angela or Sophie to a random Wi-Fi network which says password 12345678, because I made it and it's not secure and it's not what the organizers gave you. So with that note, we'll begin with Zara, who works for the engine room, and she can explain what that is briefly. I won't do bios, but we'll expect each of them perhaps to say a few words about their own background. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I can't believe you made a fake Wi-Fi hotspot just to make that joke here. It's impressive commitment to proving insecurity. So yeah, my name's Zara. Rahman. I work for an organization called the Engine Room. We're a small non-profit organization. Our mission is basically to support other civil society organizations, including in the humanitarian space, to use technology and data in a more effective and strategic way. So kind of giving the good guys superpowers, as someone once described it, which I kind of like. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 main topics that I've seen across the board when it comes to kind of data ethics and privacy and security. So we don't work exclusively in the humanitarian space, but also with human rights organizations or with everything in the realm of kind of social justice, so positive social change. And those 2 big topics are really understanding the role of power and how that plays into how data can be used. And the second one is understanding the role of data in our work. So on the first one, I think the humanitarian space is probably home to what must be the biggest power asymmetry between the people who are gathering the data versus the people from whom the data is being gathered. And that makes a number of things really difficult that we try and do when we're thinking about handling sensitive data. The main one among those is getting informed consent. I think there are differing views on this, but it becomes almost impossible to gather informed consent, not for lack of trying, but when you, as a humanitarian organization, really just don't know what the risks are and you can't disclose what they are. And when the possibilities of what can be done with data are so uncertain. Helen Nissenbaum actually had a really nice piece that came out in the Harvard Business Review this week on how poorly consent has been operationalized. So how we often think of it as almost a checkbox to say, yes, I got consent for this. This means I can do all these things. And I think in the humanitarian space that becomes just so difficult when there's so many other factors at play. Yeah. And also, I think the way in which we see the power asymmetry playing out is in kind of ownership of the data, in who has agency to be able to control and say what happens to their data, to make changes when there are errors. I'd love for all of us to start thinking about better ways of granting beneficiaries agency and granting them ways of saying, no, I don't want you to do this with my data, but I do want to access your services, without having to give up biometric data, for example, if they're not comfortable with it, or without having to disclose things that we ourselves wouldn't feel comfortable with. And I think we see lots of double standards in this space of countries or governments that have pushed back against having biometric national ID systems in their own country, but then will implement that as aid or within the humanitarian sector. I think that's just an interesting comparison to make, maybe a question to ask ourselves of would we be okay with this kind of disclosure or this kind of this kind of data collection if it were for ourselves. And then on to the kind of the second point, understanding the role of data. I think I would love for everyone to see data as more of a toxic asset rather than a thing that they should be collecting more and more of. I think with stronger regulation like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, we are beginning to see organizations understanding that if they hold such a large amount of personal data in certain countries or from certain people, then they do have to put a lot more effort into data protection. Hopefully we're going to see more and more of that data protection regulation or copycats or spread into other countries. But in the meantime, regardless of regulation, holding huge amounts of personal data is just a huge risk. Whether you can say or pretend that you have, perfect security, there's really no such thing as perfect security. And that means that if you're collecting incredibly sensitive data, you might want to think twice. You might want to try practicing data minimization and really only collecting what you need for a specific amount of time for a specific purpose. I think there's many, as well as the legal risks, there are kind of ethical questions around what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And it would be horrible for the one thing that changes this behavior in this space to be a huge data breach that has huge negative consequences. And I think we should be planning for that and in advance of that potential, not so hypothetical, because it could very easily happen, breach of very sensitive data. I think one space that we're seeing lots of sensitive data being gathered is of biometric data. I've been looking at the case of how data has been gathered on the Rohingya in Bangladesh and Myanmar. That's, I guess, a disaster waiting to happen in many ways, because there's such sensitive data being gathered, and the governments of both Myanmar and Bangladesh especially, they have explicitly said that the reason that they want this data is so that they can make sure that the Rohingya do not stay. And that can't be clearer. That is so explicit that it just makes me wonder, why is anyone collecting this data? Like, we all, humanitarian operations they all happened pre-biometric data. They might have been, I don't know, I've heard arguments of kind of less efficient or all these sorts of problems, but is anything worth that kind of risk when everyone involved has been very, very explicit about what those risks are? I think just to end, there are many types of sensitive data in this space. Biometric data is one that I worry specifically about, just because it's immutable, it's permanent, it can't be changed by the individual. It really takes away a lot of the kind of potential agency that people could have over what they hold. Hopefully we'll talk more about that later.
Great. Thank you very much, Zara. And Karl, why do you do this? No.
Ben, it's true that I signed on your Wi-Fi, but that doesn't mean that I have to tell you all my secrets. No, good afternoon, and yes, I'm from UNHCR, and we are for a couple of decades in not only in the refugee business, but in the task of collecting personal data, processing personal data on refugees. And we are doing this since the beginning of the organization. That means very much preceding today and the risks and opportunities which information technology provides. And I wanted to introduce the topic with maybe a few headlines. One is responsibility, accountability, and the other one is what are the risks and dilemmas. So we have more than data of more than 8 million people in our databases. Just for you to compare that, that is the population of Austria. That's a whole country. And we have biodata, we call it. Biodata, the personal data, which makes up the identity of a person. In most cases, the claimed identity. People tell us who they are, and it's recorded the way they tell us. And this is matched in most cases with their biometrics. And we believe for good reason, because everyone has the right to have an identity. If you look at the SDGs, 16.9 is about everybody by 2030 should have an identity. And you know what it means to live in a country, or maybe you don't know, but we can tell you what it means to live in a country without an identity. Being a foreigner, being a refugee, being somebody without papers. So there is obviously, very obviously, value for the majority of refugees in being able to identify themselves. And there are risks, obviously. We are using this data, first of all, as I said, for identification. But even if you just look at it from administering aid, you know, I do not want to tell you how this was done before biometrics came, when refugee camps were encircled in the middle of the night by the police, and people were chased out of their houses and moved into enclosures and treated like not very dignified, you know. And that indeed biometrics is a way of, we believe, resolving this issue of identifying and authenticating in a much more dignified manner than it was done before. Now, to whom are we accountable? Well, first of all, we are accountable to the people whose data we hold. And obviously, as I said before, you ought to be registered in most places to have refugee status. And if you can't show that you have that status through an identity token, through an ID card, then you are in deep trouble. It is true that we have not designed our systems privacy by design or privacy by default. That is not the case. We have to do a retrofit. The High Commissioner does indeed want that refugees have agency over their data. But in order to have agency over your data, in order to manage your data, that data has to be credible. No one is going to accept, you know, an untrustworthy, if you want, identity. That's just child's play. That's not going to work. We know that. You know, we have seen it in many places over many years. So an identity has to be strong, and identity has to be trustworthy. And then I think we can, and technology obviously or hopefully provides that opportunity to give people their identity back, and they can manage it. But then let's look at the other accountabilities and responsibilities we have. UNHCR is a UN agency. It's an intergovernmental agency. We are not registering without the consent, or even stronger than that. We are not registering refugees unless we are asked for by the host government. So we are basically, it's a task delegated to us. So we are accountable to governments. And not only to governments who are hosting refugees, we are also accountable to governments who are ready to resettle refugees. And you know that no refugee is resettled on this planet unless he has been vetted for security reasons by the very security agencies the various states have. And, you know, despite of what is happening in the US is still the biggest resettlement country. And it is the very same states which in conferences like the Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain want us to exchange data. because they believe that data exchange makes aid delivery more efficient. So, we are not accountable responsible towards countries of origin. So identity data is never checked with any country of origin. So if someone comes and claims to be so-and-so, and even if we have the strongest doubts about that, we would never go back to the country of origin and check that. However, the country of origin comes back when into the game, so to speak, at time of repatriation. Obviously, a country, we know when a crisis is over or a refugee situation is over and the agreement has been reached that there will be voluntary repatriation, the country which will receive its citizens has to be notified who is coming. And how are you notify these countries other with their personal data? And we have had many times situations where countries have refused to take refugees back, saying, well, you know, whoever you put on this list is not a citizen of our country. He is not a citizen of our country, hence he can't come back. Now, that has, again, nothing to do with IT, but that's then an issue which has to be resolved politically. And finally, I think the accountability we have is to our partners, because obviously we are not alone in this crisis situations. There is data sharing going on. If we would not share our data, let's say, with the World Food Programme, refugees would go hungry. If we would not share data with medical agencies and so on, obviously health and other services would not be working. Cash, I mean, you know, the whole move from in-kind assistance to cash is unthinkable without biometrics. No donor would give us money to distribute cash without there are some minimum, what can I say, assurances that this money is arriving in what is considered to be the proper hands. Now, risks, yes, there are many risks, and we know them. I can tell you that most of our databases are actually not central. They are not on the internet. They are in some server rooms in places you can't even find on the map. I'm not sure. Geneva you can find on the map. But just to tell you that security is not only an issue on the net, and we are under the same attack like everybody else. I can get a weekly report who has tried to use my login credentials, you know, in various places to get into our systems. We know that data breaches do happen. We know that they will be very difficult. No one can guarantee you that they will never happen. But we think, considering the various dilemmas we have, that is, you know, something we have to deal with. We cannot simply, you know, put data on memory sticks because they can't be hacked there, and for the other reasons which I elaborated earlier. And yes, and we are trying with others to have clear rules and regulations on how data sharing is done, minimum disclosure, aggregation of data, anonymized data, you name it. We are facing other problems, technological problems, problems of people not being properly trained, and so on and so forth. That is all true. But there is no other way to go forward. We would be completely irrelevant, and we would, I think, risk the welfare and the protection of refugees if we would not try to go this way and do it right. So the question is not whether or not we do it, the question is whether we do it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karl, for a very frank talk. Now it is Paul.
It is. So I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer for a financial technology company. Before that, I worked purely in the humanitarian sector. And most of my work was around information management, information technology, about how to use data better. And one of the things that's been very interesting in making that transition from a purely humanitarian approach to a hybrid of private sector and humanitarian is understanding the way in which the political economy of personal identity and the commercial logic of big data have collided basically in the last couple of years. And I think this is the source of a lot of the challenges that we face. So we first of all take the political economy of personal identity. Both Zara and Karl have outlined ways in which that's enacted, Zara particularly with the Rohingya situation, and Karl more broadly with the way in which personal identity has a value for all the different actors in a humanitarian operation. The problem is that the asymmetry of power that Degan Ali talked about this morning is seen very clearly when it comes to personal identity. For a humanitarian organization, registering one more refugee or one more recipient of aid is a marginal step. You know, if you've got a database filled with several thousand names, adding one onto that is not that big a deal. For the refugee or the aid recipient, it means that it could mean the difference between life or death, between having access to assistance or not having access to assistance, between being eligible for resettlement and not being eligible for resettlement. So that power is embedded right in the heart of that issue of personal identity. What makes it really strange, for me at least, is that if you go back 120 years or so, none of this would have made any sense to anybody. Passports didn't really exist. Personal identity was not something that the government told you had. It's something that has crept up on all of us. And obviously it's crept up on industrial and post-industrialized countries more than it has in other places, but it is creeping up on everybody. And Karl is absolutely right. You know, this in many ways is a better way of handling things like refugee registration. But I think it's more true to say that it's an unavoidable step. There is no way that this is not going to happen. And by this, I mean the digitization of humanitarian assistance. What we see happening with cash distribution is really driving that move towards digitization. But digitization will happen to everything. It'll happen to medical, it'll happen to non-food distribution, it'll happen to protection. And we're just at the start of that. So we do have an opportunity, I think, a window of opportunity to try and do it right. The question is, what does doing it right mean? And that's where the second half of my thoughts come into play. The way in which data is generally framed, is generally viewed, generally worked with, has a commercial logic to it. The commercial logic of big data is gather as much data as you can and then work out how to monetize it. Now, that obviously has a lot of problems when it comes to humanitarian operations. There's no way of monetizing humanitarian data ethically. We should never even think about doing it. We shouldn't be selling off any sort of data regarding people who've been affected by disaster. That's very clear. So there's no way of monetizing it. So then that raises the question of, well, why are you collecting all this data? The idea being that if you collect enough data, you can start to see patterns and you can make better decisions. So that commercial logic is there, even if the monetization aspect isn't. The challenge then is that we have this commercial logic, but with that commercial logic comes a set of assumptions about the way the world works. And what I think worries me most is that these assumptions are hidden underneath the technology. The way the technology has been developed and implemented by organizations like Facebook, by governments, it has a certain logic to it, which we are inheriting as we take the same type of technological approaches. And so I think when you take those two things together, this political economy around what personal identity means and the commercial logic that's attached to collecting data, particularly large-scale data, this is where you create this tension. This is where you have this huge, huge potential for catastrophe and, frankly, quite a small potential for incremental improvements in the way that business is done. So one of the other things that I've been working on is looking at digital identity. And I just completed a report that was funded by DFID that was looking at how digital identity is applied to refugees. And we looked at Jordan, Lebanon, and Uganda. We went to those countries, went to the refugee camps and settlements, talked to people about their everyday experiences, talked to the implementing organizations to understand how they were using that data. We also did a literature review to look at what it already exists out there in terms of knowledge and understanding. And consistently what you find when you're talking to agencies or reading the literature is the argument that this will make our operations more effective, more efficient. This is better for the recipients of aid, in this case particularly for refugees, but more broadly for people affected by disaster, this will be a better way of doing things. Now, I tend to agree with that argument, but what alarms me is there's almost no evidence for it. So intuitively, to me, it makes sense that yes, if you digitize these things, you do get an improvement in the effectiveness and the efficiency and possibly the transparency. But we need to have more evidence to support that before we expose people to more risks. And I think what's happening at the moment, and this is not a slight towards any of the agencies, because I've, as I said, talked to a lot of the people working in these agencies, and most of them are very concerned about this, the technology runs ahead of our capacity to implement it. The engine room did a piece of work with Oxfam, and some of you may know that Oxfam put a 2-year moratorium on implementing biometrics in their operations because they weren't sure about the risks. They weren't sure they could do it right. That moratorium is now over, but they're still not sure about how to do it right. But they're trying to move forward slowly but surely. And as I said before, we have a window of opportunity to do things right. But I think doing things right actually means doing things differently. It means looking at the commercial logic around the way that data is used, looking at the political economy of how personal identity is used, and trying to imagine different ways of doing things, ways that do have privacy by design at the heart of them, ways that do have the autonomy of the recipients of aid embedded right in them, and using technologies that don't lend themselves to the sort of commercialization and the risks that come along with it, which include, of course, data breaches. But my worry is not the data breaches. My worry is the way in which our personal data is being commodified, not that our personal data is being leaked. And we can't afford to expose people who've been affected by disaster to that kind of risk. So there is an opportunity. Whether we'll be able to take it or not is still open.
Thank you very much, Paul. Rousing stuff. And finally, Maria-Elena from the ICRC.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria-Elena Ciccolini. I'm Data Protection Officer at the International Committee of the Red Cross. So in these few minutes, I will try to share with you, from a data protection officer perspective, the challenges that the ICRC as a humanitarian organization has to face when it processes data of vulnerable people. So as my colleagues have said, we know, as we see every day, digital revolution has changed the way in which we live, we work, we relate to each other. And it has not only changed in our everyday life, but in emergency and in conflict situation. We see new needs emerging. Beneficiaries themselves ask for connectivity. So it's no longer only food, shelter, or water. When they reach a humanitarian organization, they will ask for connectivity. The digital revolution has also created the need for humanitarian organizations themselves to leverage data in the sense of being able to read and interpret data in real time, to get accurate reading of the environment, identifying trends, identifying challenges and dangers. And the more we go digital, of course, and this is a data protection officer saying it, the more we need to protect our data and the systems we use. I'll take the same examples that my colleagues mentioned, cash transfers. In the past, a cash transfer would be a bilateral conversation between the humanitarian organization and the beneficiary. Nowadays, you use third-party processors with whom you share data. So you will have a bank or other financial institution, and sometimes the choice is limited because you are in an emergency, in a conflict situation, and you don't have the number of banks or financial institutions you can choose from, like we have here. And you will have telecom operators that are sometimes the only telecom operator that is available and might be controlled by one of the parties to the conflict. And by sharing data with these third-party processors, you are never sure that while you are using a technology that might be considered as efficient, the result of your program and of your cash transfer, I will give you a concrete example, is really effective. What we have noticed, for example, while monitoring some of our pilot programs, was that, as you may know, banks in many countries need to go through a process of creditworthiness. So you provide them with the data of your beneficiaries, and they will have to check if these people have a debt with the bank or another financial institution. And if they have a debt, the transfer, the cash that as ICRC we wish to transfer to the beneficiary will be diverted to reimburse a debt. Or what we've seen is, and as we know and hear every day these days around migration, for example, telecom operators have a duty of disclosure to law enforcement agencies, or sometimes, if they are controlled by one of the parties to the conflict, will have to share data with them about geolocation, for example, or calls and relations, contacts of some of the people, which may cause, and has caused in some of our projects, the geolocation of people that were fleeing from that very part to the conflict. So in one case, the beneficiary would not receive what we had, the amount of money we had decided to allocate them. In another case, they would receive, but would need to start fleeing again to save their lives. So we see that we might be using an efficient technology, but we are not sure about the effectiveness of our programs. So in my view, a very important tool is, you might have heard of it, especially in the new General Data Protection Regulation, a data protection impact assessment. I think it is really the responsibility of each organization starting a new program, designing a new program, or receiving funds to use a new technology to carry out a thorough and serious data protection impact assessment. It's not an easy task. I think that most organizations are, for the time being, a bit lost. It's a big task. You have to develop methodologies, formats, etc., train people to be able to do this job. But it's the only way to be able to identify the risks, to make sure you know which flows the data you are sharing with third parties, which flows they are following, and be able to put in place mitigation measures. Or sometimes decide that this technology is not the one you will be using in this context because it's too risky. As a last note, some of you may know, the ICRC with the Brussels Privacy Hub has been working and published a handbook on data protection and humanitarian action. We have just launched the second working series, where we will analyze additional new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, to see what the challenges are from a data protection perspective, to be able to guide our colleagues, but also other organizations in this endeavor to try to serve our beneficiaries in the best way, in the right way, with the do no harm and do no digital harm in mind. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe a round of applause for all our speakers. A round of applause for Claudia too, who's going to draw a blockchain. Yeah, and if she hasn't drawn a robot by the end of this session, I think we'll all be disappointed. I'm going to start with that thing at the end. Has it ever happened that somebody has not used this technology as a result of looking at the risk? In the case of ICRC, have you done an impact assessment and said, no, we can't do it?
In the very case I've mentioned, we checked at global impact in how many cases beneficiaries would encounter problems and how many cases the assistance would be with no issues. And I mean, the result was globally far more positive than negative. So we decided that in that very context, we would go on. But in a specific territory, part of the area we were serving, we changed financial institution.
Karl, same question.
Well, to tell you the first and maybe the embarrassing part of it is that we have been introducing technology first and doing the impact assessment second. That is hopefully not going to happen again, but that is the reality also. You know, if you deal with hundreds of thousands of millions of people walking in, how much time you spend on the assessment before you start the action, the humanitarian action, that is. As I said, we are doing retrofit. Yeah, the impact assessments we have done on programs, cash or biometrics or this or that, have shown certain weaknesses and certain things which need to be fixed. And we are going to do that.
Zara, do your clients acknowledge that they have risk? Are people like knocking down your door to understand these problems?
I will say we've become a bit more popular since GDPR, which is, I'll take it, whatever. I mean, just to bring up the example that Paul already mentioned, that I really appreciate that Oxfam introduced this moratorium because they recognized that there were kind of unforeseen risks or risks that might happen that they didn't know about. And I actually see that as a huge innovation, that was incredibly forward thinking. And it makes me think of what Paul was saying earlier about doing it right, doing this whole digital thing right. And I think for me, a key point in that is doing it slowly. I think we've all taken a lot from the kind of Silicon Valley approach of move fast, break things, whatever, we'll fix it retroactively or we'll fix it, at some point, but we just have to try stuff, throw it against the wall. And I think in the humanitarian space especially, we don't have that liberty to try and fix things, and actually being slow and thoughtful and intentional is a key part of doing it right. And it might mean not being the first one to try the new technology. It might mean not using AI, whatever that even means right now. But it just means really being intentional about what we're doing, even though there are kind of very pressing, timely things that are happening.
Thank you. Paul, you said there were huge, huge risks. Can you give us maybe something more specific on an example of doing it wrong and an example of doing it right?
Yeah,
or you may repeat what Zara says.
So the one thing I'd like to start with is recognizing that large organizations like yours do have this problem of legacy systems that need to be retrofitted, essentially. That essentially you're having to layer on data protection onto existing systems and work out how to then move forward. And that's no easy challenge. I think we're likely to see, I predict two things. One is that there'll be a major data breach at some point, which will expose recipients of aid to additional risk. And that will be the thing that will wake up the sector. That hasn't happened yet, as far as I know. I think we would possibly know about it if we've had a few breaches, but none that have directly impacted the lives of the most vulnerable. The other part is I think we're going to, I don't want to predict an apocalypse, because I think we're living in the
just a
apocalypse.
catastrophe,
No, so in the sense that I have serious concerns about privacy in general, not just for people affected by disasters, community affected by disasters. I think we all need to face up to the fact that we are living in a kind of apocalypse when it comes to privacy, personal agency. This is something that I believe is happening. Now, you may not share that. Hands up who shares that view.
All those of you living in an apocalypse.
The secret meeting is at 5 o'clock in the back. So if you do buy into that way of thinking, then obviously this is just a reflection of a much broader issue, and it occupies me because I work in this sector. I'd like to think that one of the opportunities to do things differently, one of the things that we'll see, is we will start to see, I think, a wave of digital-first humanitarian organizations. Organizations that are relatively new, that do have privacy by design at the heart, that do take, in the same way that you have a wave now of digital banks, digital-first banks or mobile-first banks. I think we'll start to see organizations coming up, and they probably will come up from countries not that we traditionally expect humanitarian organizations to come from. They'll come from places like the Philippines. They'll come from places like Korea or India or Malaysia. They may well come, I think, from countries like Kenya or Nigeria, where you do have strong and growing tech economies. And I think that presents a real opportunity of doing things not just right, doing things differently, of presenting a range of alternatives. And I think that for me is the key. We don't know how things are going to go. We don't know how the technology is going to develop. We need to test. We need to experiment. Now, it's not good to experiment on vulnerable communities. It's good to experiment on ourselves as organizations and humanitarians first. But what I would like to see is a wider range of options, because as I said at the start, I recognize that the large institutions have a duty of care, and that you're approaching that in different ways, but you are addressing it, and that's all to the good. What I want is a wider range of options on the table for humanitarian organizations, big and small, northern and southern, dealing with preparedness, with response, with all of these aspects. But I want to see more options. I want us to explore those options.
Great, thanks. I'm going to raise one more topic and then go to the audience. The topic I didn't hear that much about was donors. Both you mentioned them, Karl, is that they wouldn't even allow you not to use this stuff. I mean, to what extent are they driving this, and are they, in fact, so eager to be reassured that it pushes you to do irresponsible things? I've heard that from some of your colleagues in big organizations. Second point, what about your individual donors? MSF has 8 million people, they told me, in their mailing list of private individuals who give them money. And those data concerns are also perhaps something we haven't touched on. Karl?
Well, I think donors are driving the aid sector in general, so why shouldn't they be driving the IT and identity part? That would be naive to think they wouldn't. And they go very far. Let me just tell you, look at what is happening in Uganda. In Uganda, basically, the donors told the Ugandan government that if they don't give refugee registration back to UNHCR, there would be no more food for refugees. And that was for more than 1 million people. And so following that intervention, the UNHCR is now assisting the government to re-register their entire caseload. So that is just, Let me just say something about the complexity of the issue and whether it is good to have a moratorium or not, or this or the other. Biometrics. One of our biggest biometric databases we have is the biometric database of Afghan refugees who have returned from Pakistan to Afghanistan. I can't tell you how many million people their data is in that database. But it's all anonymous. There is not a single name attached to it. The system, how this biometrics works, is basically you present yourself with a document and you say, I've been living in Pakistan for so and so many years as an Afghan refugee. I want to go back to my country. I give you my identity document back. You give me, they get $100 per person or something like that. And then the biometric data is checked, and if that person is not found in the database, he's paid. And so we have we have a completely anonymous database, which a lot of people are interested, companies, they would like to have a hold on it. But that is a way you can use biometrics. There are other ways, but then if you go, for instance, to a biometric conference with companies, they tell you, and by the way, DNA testing, we can do it in 5 minutes. And it is biometric. But that is an interesting thought, You know that with DNA testing, you not only identify the person, you identify several persons around that person. But that is being offered. This is being offered to us, is being offered to states, is being offered as the future of biometrics. Not that I'm advocating for it, but we have to be extremely alert. Because as Paul said, the technology is racing and we are stumbling, and we have to therefore catch up and do it right. Now, what is the aid, the economy of the aid sector? I think the World Economic Forum or the GSMA Association, I don't remember who of them, they estimate that $2 billion per year are transferred in cash through aid agencies to individual recipients. Now, do you think there is no commercial interest in taking over that business? $2 billion? So there are so many pressures, and I think it's not only technology which will define the future, it's exactly that relationship between the private sector, the commercial sector, and the aid industry, which has been so far, to a certain extent at least, non-commercialized, which will define how this thing is going forward. Not sure I answered your question, though.
It was very interesting, though. Carry on. Maria-Elena, will you respond to that? You guys just carry on.
I think that indeed donors have a responsibility, while I'm not sure that they recognize or accept it for the time being. You may have the same donors issuing new legislation on data protection, in their own countries, and imposing innovation to aid agencies, but imposing innovation in a way that doesn't really give you the choice to assess whether you can use this new technology or not. So I think, and this is a message we usually pass, that they have a responsibility and they should somehow at some point realize it.
I really appreciate the point. I really appreciate the point that Karl made about tech companies or various private sector actors offering this huge array of what the future of technology looks like in this space. And I think it must be really hard to be faced with all these promises and say no, and say, to say, no, actually the DNA thing seems a bit weird and potentially creepy and might have huge unintended consequences, so we're going to say no to that, we're going to stick to this. At the same time, I also appreciate the mention of the Afghan-Pakistan database as an example of one that is practicing in some form data minimization, in that they're not collecting names and records. There's a really interesting an academic paper actually about that specific database that's called A Hidden History of Humanitarian Experimentation, which I can highly recommend you read if you haven't yet. It's by a professor called Katja Jacobsen. In Copenhagen, yeah. And she writes in that about how that database or that data was gathered. It was pretty early on. It was one of the first, as far as I know, one of the first instances of biometric data being used on, being collected from refugees. And she notes a number of cases of where so as Karl described, the database, basically it's collecting, it's tracking people who have crossed the border. So it basically says, have you already crossed this border? If you haven't, then you are entitled to a certain amount of money or a resettlement package. And if you have already done it, then you are not entitled to this because it's fraud, or you're trying to get the same package twice. And she records a number of cases of when people crossed over and they were found in the database as having already crossed, and the individuals themselves said, no, that wasn't, I haven't. And there's a number of quotes from staff on that case saying, well, the machine's always right. So we went with what the machine said, regardless of what, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, we went with what the machine said rather than the story that we heard in front of these people. And the particularly interesting thing about that case was the technology that was used, the technology for recording biometrics. I believe the only time it was tested prior to being used on literally millions of refugees was in something like Heathrow Airport on hundreds of people, but no more than thousands. So in completely different use cases, like so drastically different that it's no surprise that maybe the technology did not work perfectly. And I think that's a really good example of how you can design a database that practices data minimization, but going back to what Paul was saying of all of these layers of objectivity and bias and decisions that are made lower down in that technology, that we have to be really conscious and aware of all of those layers when we're considering what that technology is being used for.
I'm not going to talk about donors to start with. First of all, to second Katja Linskov-Jakobsen's paper, it's excellent, and she's done a bunch of research, solo and with colleagues. Read it, it's fantastic. The second thing is, going back to something Karl said, which is, $2 billion has been transferred back. That sounds really impressive if you're in the humanitarian sector, but the US domestic pet food market is $24 billion. $2 billion as a commercial opportunity, and I say this now as someone who needs to look at commercial opportunities, it's so niche, it's ridiculous. And I think that we consistently overestimate our importance in that sense. These commercial interests have much wider interest than us, and that leads to the question of why are they interested in us? And they're interested in us for a couple of things, I think. One is to test under very difficult circumstances their technology, to do it in something that's very high visibility, so to show that it works and that it can be seen to work, and to show off to governments. And then we come back to the donors, because which governments are they showing off to? It's the governments that will then buy that technology for them for border control, for domestic security management. So, for example, the biometric company that UNHCR has partnered with in Jordan, they're good. I mean, they're not bad. I'm not criticizing them directly. They're a biometric company, but their previous experience was border control in the United Arab Emirates, I believe. That was how the technology was developed initially. And there we can see it's very easy to flip from the positive side of registering refugees to ensure they get aid to the slightly less positive side of border control in the United Arab Emirates, to potentially a very negative side, which is the situation that Zara described in Bangladesh with refugee communities there. So if we loop that back round to the original question, yes, the donors drive things, but part of doing things differently has to be seeking to escape from that logic. I'd like to bring in one of my favorite writers, a guy called Mark Fisher, who none of you will have heard of, but he wrote a book called Capitalist Realism. And the logic of capitalist realism is to say there is no alternative. You will do things this way because there is no alternative. What else can we do? But there is always an alternative. And I think part of our role as innovators in the humanitarian space, as researchers who look for new ways of seeing things, is to look for those other ways of doing things.
Karl, you have a... I was switching.
I see, I was switching.
As I told you, a very knowledgeable and brainy panel, terrifying, really. Anybody have questions? Yes, sir. You are being hunted. Any more want to stick?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Timo. We talked a lot about data collection, but what I would like to maybe raise is the issue of data retention. Because obviously one way you can keep data more secure is by deleting it. And I think, when I hear that UNHCR now has 8 million records, or I know ICSC has whole vaults of information about people who were, for example, reunited, or these kind of things. I'm wondering, how much are you thinking about, okay, at what point has this data served its purpose and we should really delete it? Thank you.
Thanks, Timo. We do 2 more. You, sir, and you, madam.
Hi, Tom Casey, MSF Ireland. I was just wondering what you guys think the opportunities are with the amount of data that all these organisations have. And I'd be wondering if, say, the UNHCR has a database of 8 million people. Are you doing any type of analysis on that that could sort of inform your operations?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hélène Berger from Doctors of the World France. I apologize in advance, I'm absolutely not a specialist. I would like you, if possible, to develop a little bit on the blockchain technology, because it seems that it can bring some protection to beneficiaries in terms of identity, and it can be used in our field of activities. So what are your views on that, and do you have already some examples, concrete examples of its application on our field?
Thank you very much. We did a good 40 minutes before we got to blockchain, but it had to happen. And thank you for asking your question. Let's start with that. Blockchain for identity, but blockchain for every other thing as well. Paul sort of does
I guess
a bit
that's
of this. Yeah,
I do a bit of blockchain.
But we'll come to Karl as well on identity.
So the company that I'm COO of, our platform is built on blockchain technology, on distributed ledger technology. And having said that, I'm a huge skeptic about distributed ledger technology, about blockchain. It's now 10 years since the technology was first presented in its current form. We've seen almost no large-scale success stories of blockchain. Bitcoin is the only one that's reached scale. All the other cryptocurrencies are basically trailing in Bitcoin's wake. And in terms of actual applications in the real world, almost nobody is using it. That's quite a long, 10 years is quite a long time for a radical new technology to not have an impact. And so I think there's a huge question mark there about the level of hype that was attached to it. Once we go through that hype, what are the actual use cases that we can see? I do think that one of the use cases is potentially this idea of what's called self-sovereign identity, and particularly for people who've lost their state-provided identity. And in this case, obviously, refugees and other populations of concern, any population that has lost the identity that is normally granted to it by a state could benefit from having a self-sovereign identity. Self-sovereign identities are still in their early stages. There's really no one who's successfully implemented them in any practical sense. Obviously, in a purely technical proof of concept, it's been done. There's no question about that. There's a lot of distance to go before it becomes a tool that we can use. And we might cross that distance quite quickly. But I have a strong feeling that governments are going to be very hesitant about granting any kind of recognition for self-sovereign identity. Now, that means that as a legal identity, it won't be that useful. But that still leaves the possibility of a functional identity, i.e. an identity that just allows you access to a service. So I do think there's something there. It's something that we're working on. Otherwise, if I didn't think there wasn't something there, we wouldn't be working on it. Where it's going to go to, I don't know yet.
Well, normally if it comes to blockchain, I always ask back, what is my problem? Tell me what my problem is, and then you tell me why blockchain is my solution. So what is my problem? Okay, that was just kidding. Blockchain, is there anyone in this room who believes that a crypto identity which is guaranteed by Amazon or Facebook is any better than of the government of one of those 190 countries we have? Because that's what's going to happen. The self-sovereign identity in the end will be guaranteed by the very same tech companies who are developing it. We are looking into it, nevertheless. But we haven't even piloted it or anything like this. We are looking at it, and if it does solve a problem which we have, a real problem, then we will of course use it.
I can help with that, Karl.
Okay, good. After. Good. Okay, Zara, can you talk about data destruction? I mean, feel free to get on the blockchain.
I mean, just a big. No, I mean, just quickly on the blockchain stuff. I think I would ask the same question again. I really like the framing that Karl said of what's the problem, but also I think there's just so much hype right now around blockchain. And so often I've spoken to people and they've described how they're implementing it and why they're doing it. And actually what they just need is a well-organized spreadsheet. That's it. That solves all of their problems. And in some cases, we've had organizations use distributed ledger technologies. And in order to do that, they've had to clean up their data, which means that this was just a goal that they could have reached by reorganizing their data well. But there is just a lot of hype, and it could be, I mean, I spoke to someone from a project called the Rohingya project that was looking at putting identity of Rohingya people on the blockchain. And it was clear that it was very well intended. They had been listening to a lot of the hype. I strongly encouraged them to rethink what they were doing and why they were doing it for so many reasons. But basically, I think it was a potentially incredibly dangerous thing to have identities that are immutable, that cannot be deleted, of one of the world's most marginalized and persecuted communities on the blockchain, which just seems wild to me. So I'd really encourage people to take it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Maria-Elena, have you got blockchain in your new digital strategy in ICRC?
Not yet, in the sense that, as I mentioned, during the second working series of our handbook on data protection and humanitarian action, we will be analyzing the technology of blockchain. We are currently working with l'École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. They have some big specialists about blockchain, and see with them what potential applications would be. And yes, I agree, you have to identify your needs and then see if blockchain is the answer. So more will come when we publish this second version of the handbook. And on data retention, the ICRC has always had, I would say, at least for protection, for the protection profession, meaning detention visits or missing people, very strict rules on what would be kept for how long in delegation, then transferred to Geneva, then partially destroyed, partially kept into the archives for historical purposes. Because what we see is that very often we get demands years and years after from family members who would like to retrace the history of their parents, grandparents, and there are documents that can only be found in the ICRC archives. So we have very strict rules on what we keep and for what reason. So it's repurposing, it's not the initial purpose, but it's a further legitimate purpose of historical research, we can call it.
Karl, do you keep records?
Yes. This is an interesting example, because you know that the General Data Protection Directive of the European Union, which most likely is a standard-setting document for all of us, talks about the right to be forgotten. And we already heard from the ICRC that, well, there is an asterisk to it. And I can tell you, and so it's in UNHCR. We have in our archives, for instance, still the files of the International Refugee Organization, you know, the organization which was immediately after the Second War. Yes, there are once in a while very legitimate inquiries by lawyers, by family members, where they want to access those files. So, therefore, yes, there is no need to maintain assistance data beyond a certain date, but there are other use cases where indeed the data will be kept and has been kept while it was on paper and will be kept in the future when it is digitalized.
But is it in the same secret bunker?
If I would tell you, it would no longer be secret.
Data analysis for other purposes. I mean, this is the opportunity. I think you do have something of that in ICRC. This is the second question.
Yes, data analysis for other purposes. Okay, nowadays there is a tendency to analyze, or a desire to analyze for whatever purpose, all kind of data that is in our hands. This is the data protection officer speaking. So for us, you can't just analyze or reprocess the data for a purpose that is not reasonably expected by the data subject. So when we review programs and operations these days, we always suggest to our colleagues that this is taken into account from the very beginning of the project, because in many cases it is possible. If you collect a tracing request, if you collect, I mean, yes, I think this is a very good example, in fact. When you collect a tracing request, so you have a missing person, and then in other circumstances you collect data on grave sites, on migratory routes, you might explain from the very beginning to the people that approach you that you might have to connect the dots so that you are able to go a bit further into the tracing, not just the active classic tracing we have done until now, where you physically go and try to trace the person, or you try to match names, but go further, go beyond, and maybe be more successful. Because when it is about migration, for example, most of the tracing requests that are related to migration cases are extremely difficult to be solved. I mean, we know migratory routes are extremely dangerous, and in many cases, just people disappear, and you know absolutely nothing. They not all reach the Mediterranean Sea or a vessel that is rescued. So we might have cases where you can foresee from the very beginning that there will be a need to do, let's call it, big data analysis, and people should be informed from the very beginning. And some of them will say no. So we will take a tracing request and not use the data for further research. In other cases, I mean, there is a tendency now, colleagues would jump into any kind of analytics, and we are behind reminding that it is not just something you can do. You do not have a blanket authorization just because people consented to provide you data for a specific purpose.
Thank you. Maybe, Paul, you said the big data kind of assumptions of the commercial sector were being swallowed whole by the humanitarian, but aren't there opportunities? You can see everybody is suddenly selling their stuff or buying their stuff, or the rents have gone up or the rents have gone down. Surely this data is important.
I think there are opportunities. I think so the struggle on my side is to, if you do identify an opportunity, is how do you measure whether the risk involved or the impact that it'll have will actually be positive enough. As I said, the commercial logic is gather as much data and then identify ways in which we monetize. That's how you tell if the data is valuable or a particular analysis is valuable. We don't have that. We can't make that judgment because we can't monetize the data. So what are the metrics by which we measure how good a particular opportunity is for that sort of analysis? The second thing, of course, is there's precious little humanitarian data. So the refugee movements, I think migration movements are one which you can identify, but a lot of data is just data. And it has to be sort of, abstracted from much larger data sets. So mobile phone data is often identified as being a really good opportunity for analysis, and I think it is. But it's not humanitarian data, it's just this broader data. And I guess finally, the thing that I just don't know about is that so as I said, I've been working in the sector for a long time, and most of it's been around information. Historically, the humanitarian sector is insanely bad at connecting information that it gathers to decisions it makes. We're not good at evidence-based decision-making. We're not good at data-driven decision-making. That might change in the future. But this question of, well, should we be collecting this data? Should we be doing this analysis? I'd say maybe, but I'd like to see that actually there was some evidence that we were using that to make better decisions. Because at the moment, there's very little evidence that we are using it to make better decisions. There's very little evidence that we're using evidence, I guess, which proves my point.
I'd say just to add to that, I don't think it's just the humanitarian sector. I mean, humans are irrational beings. There's been so much hype around more data leads to better decision making, and it's not actually just in the humanitarian sector that there's a distinct lack of evidence that this happens. We're just irrational beings. We don't make decisions based on numbers and figures. We make it, in this case, on political will, on all sorts of other things. I think there is opportunity, of course, in data and technology, or else I wouldn't do the job I do. I worry that the opportunity is misplaced, or the potential is misplaced. So the example that Paul mentioned of call details records or mobile phone data being used, there was a great study done by Sean McDonald a couple of years ago on how call details records were used in the Ebola response. And you should go and read the paper, but long story short is all of this very privacy invasive data was made available and lots of pressure was put on certain governments of Ebola affected countries to make this data available. And all of the governments apart from Liberia did so. And the data did not help with the response. The data was not helpful for how Ebola is transferred between people, but there was someone who, there were people who thought, the answer will be in the data. I think that's a really potentially dangerous route to go down. You have to be strategic with what answer you're looking for from the data that you have. And I think it's a really, potentially risky route to take, to just say, we've got all this data, or we could get access to all this data, therefore let's look for this answer. And I think it could lead to a lot of wasted resources within the humanitarian sector.
Right, more.
If I may start, how worried should we be that there would be pressure from, say, Western countries on having access to data gathered by NGOs, and that the demand would be formulated under the guise of we need your data for law enforcement issues or for counterterrorism measures, but that actually would be used to try and have an impact or have a grip on migration flows. As in several European countries, this has come on top of the policy agenda. Has there been pressure in this kind already on NGOs, and how worried should I be about this for the future times?
Thank you very much. Okay. Just to remain in the same order, is there not a gentleman in the middle here? Oh, you, madam, sorry. Go ahead. And then you.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one, so what do we do with the data that we collect? After we collect the data, what are we supposed to do with it? How can we protect it? And the second one, don't you think there's a huge gap between the people in the field that we're supposed to be developing with and asking them to do the work for themselves and the technologies that you're talking about? Because so many of them don't even know how to read and write.
Thank you. Claudia?
Thanks, Claudia with GPPI. I wanted to continue on this, the question of commercial interests. And I feel that the discussion hasn't really finished on that. My question would be, especially to the operational agencies, where do you draw the red line if the data uses that Paul has sketched out of kind of like testing certain technologies in bigger settings and then selling them to governments, that's not in and by itself violating the protection of the data itself of an individual, but there are interests that you're contributing to. Where do you draw the line, and how do you decide whether you work with a company or not?
Thank you very much. Maybe you, Maria-Elena, you can pick one or two or three of those. Just, you know.
I'll start with the question on migration. I mean, it is indeed an issue. It's easier to deal with for the ICRC, for example. We always sign headquarters agreement where we work. In the headquarters agreement, we foresee various privileges like inviolability of premises, of data, of archives, and we have recognized privilege of non-disclosure, which means that if a government or law enforcement agency tries to ask information from us, we have all the legal means to say no. It's much more difficult for all these organizations and NGOs who do not have privileges and immunities, and increasingly, yes, they receive requests from law enforcement when they manage a center for migrants, when they serve migrants, whether it is health services or other kind of services. For us, for example, when we work, and we very often work with what we call national societies, the German Red Cross, the Belgian Red Cross, etc., since they do not have these kind of immunities, it's more difficult for them to resist. They need to have discussions to have their independence, their neutrality, their impartiality recognized, and the ability to carry out their activities in full independence. So sometimes it's easy to, I mean, easy is a big word, but they manage to convince and not reply to the requests. In other cases, they are obliged. And this is something we take into account when we set up programs, and this is something we take into account when we carry out data protection impact assessments. Every time we have to share data with a third party, we assess whether the third party has a duty of disclosure to law enforcement, be it for migration or other cases, because we know that then that the risk is increased.
Before you give that away, could you just go to the question about red lines and, you know, where do you, from Claudia, where would you draw the line?
Can you
if a commercial operator offers you an amazing deal, or a credit card company offers you a concessional rate, or at what point do you say no thanks?
I don't think we would just, I mean, my experience is that if we believe the risk is too high, whether it is a wonderful deal or an excellent price, we would still say no. I mean, it's not just about risk for our beneficiaries, it also has an impact on our reputation. It would have an impact on our reputation. So I don't think that just a very nice deal or a very good price would make us let go on our principles.
Zara, about literacy, did that come up in Bangladesh?
Well, I guess to go to, I was going to ignore your question and go to her one. On the question of how to protect the data that you collect and what to do with it, I guess in an ideal world, you wouldn't collect the data unless you know exactly what you're going to do with it. So that wouldn't be a question that you come to after the fact, and you wouldn't be asking yourself, how do I protect this? But you'd say, if you do, whether it's a privacy impact assessment or a data protection impact assessment, you'd say, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? What data do I need to do it? what capacity do I have in-house or externally to protect that data, and then what data can I reasonably collect in order to solve that problem? Yeah, I think that was the...
And on the second part of the question, yes, there is a gap between the technological availability for the organizations and for the people they're supposed to serve. But one of the interesting things is, I think Karl alluded to this a little bit earlier, one of the interesting things that's happening, of course, is that with mobile phone penetration, that starts to even out in some ways. Now, obviously, what you can do with a mobile phone is very different from what you can do with a biometric database. But the connectivity that Maria-Elena mentioned, this is something that people are demanding now. And there are still, obviously, more marginalized communities that do not have access even to that level of technology. But given the rate and spread of mobile phone penetration, the dynamic has really shifted in terms of what technology is available to people. And it creates a lot of opportunities. And again, I don't think we're making use of those opportunities in the way that we probably should, but it creates, I think, a change in the power relationships between the affected individuals and communities and the organizations. The reason they want connectivity is because they want information. The reason they want information is so they can make decisions. And those decisions might be about work, they might be about where to go next, it might be about where to access help, but information in these contexts is power. So by giving them connectivity, you give them access to information, potentially you give them more power. And this is something the humanitarian community has obviously struggled with greatly over the years. So there's something really interesting going on there, and I don't think it breaks down as simply as they don't have technology, we do. There's something else going on, but it's very, very difficult to see it because we struggle to see it from their perspective a lot of the time. There is some interesting research on that, Kim Wilson's research on the ways in which refugees have used technology in the European refugee crisis, for example, around identity specifically. But these are things which we're still exploring, I think. So, yeah.
Great. I realize we're nearly out of time, so maybe you all could have one last remark and perhaps catch the question we haven't really caught, and you haven't had a chance to answer. Thank you, Karl.
Well, maybe. And then that will be my last remark. We had a mobile pay program in Niamey a couple of years back, and we thought, we are cutting edge and glory to us. Until the women who received the cash by phone basically told us that they don't want this. That they can't read and write, many of them. They have to go to middlemen to read the SMS, which gives them the transaction. They have to pay cuts and so on. So we decided to drop the program and give out cash. That was obviously what they wanted. And I guess it is this liberty which we should try to keep for ourselves, that yes, let's do try and error, and if we error, then let's correct it as quickly as we can. But there is no way that we can stay where we are. We have to somehow navigate this landscape, this digital, the shifting sand dunes. I come from Niger, of the digital landscape. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to add a few words on the question of, yes, we deal with people that sometimes have a very low level of education or data literacy. How can we pass all these messages about new technology or even more basic messages? And from a data protection point of view, it is how can we say that consent is informed and valid? In many cases, I think we should be more patient and take a bit more time than what we usually do, because there are always ways you can explain things. You can put things in words that are not legal, with concrete examples that, and in a way that in the context speaks to people. So I think there is a possibility to pass messages that may seem very complicated. But it is true that consent is, we would say in the ICRC that it is the preferred legal basis to collect and process data, but we realize it cannot be used in many, many instances. And we would prefer, for example, public interest or vital interest, which gives us the same duty of informing the people from whom we collect data, but we can formulate things in a slightly different manner. And I totally agree with Paul that the gap is becoming less and less, because thanks to mobile phones, data literacy is increasing, and because of connectivity, it is increasing, and the gap is becoming smaller.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess just to sum up, I know it might sound like the opposite with all the criticizing I've done, but I really do believe that technology and data has the potential to really strengthen and make more efficient and effective all of the work we do. And I think at the same time, it's crucial that while we do that, we accept and we recognize all the different vulnerabilities that are opened up with that same use. So I think it's very possible to think both and to recognize both of those. I think crucial to that will be learning from each other's mistakes and learning from each other's experiences and being open about the challenges that we're being faced with. And I think that humanitarian agencies at some point, with all of this incredibly sensitive data that is being gathered, will have to establish some kinds of red lines of, for example, with the Rohingya in Bangladesh, whether you continue to collect that data or whether you try and get rid of it as soon as you can because you realize that it's a toxic asset that could put millions of lives at risk.
So everything that they said. I don't have anything useful to add, but I do think it's worth emphasizing one last thing, which is this is not about data, this is about power. And we should always remember that. Don't get distracted by the technology, don't get distracted by the hype. These are questions of power, and we have to approach them as questions of power.